Well, I don't know what the differences are between writing in French versus writing in English because I never have been writing extensively in English, though I can certainly know the differences of publishing in French and publishing in English because Quebec is a very small market, readership slash market. We are 6 million French speakers, so it's a big village. And then, publishing is not, there's not much competition. While when I saw my books translated in English and getting onto the English-Canadian market, then the UK market, then the American market, you realize that this is a whole different game out there, and that there's lots of competition, and so it's different. It's very different. Whenever you write, whenever you get published, you get used to the fact that there's going to be lots of editing. Even if you've been in the trade for years and it's your fifth novel, it's always the same. You send the novel, the manuscript to the editor, and it comes back and it's read. Well, it used to be read when we were using paper. Now it's, lots of edits in it. But the few, experiences I had writing in English were that there were, even more, edits to on the text, and up, to, I don't know, past a certain level, it is just too much, working on grammar stuff that I handle very well in French, but in English, it's a problem. It's amazing. I've been starting to learn English when I was 10 years old, and decades after, I still don't manage the language. That's quite a complex, language. You don't realize it. One would think that it's easier to write in English because I've been, reading in English for the past 10 years. Most of what I read is in English. So very often I write in French, and sentences or words or expressions pop in my head are in English, and then I've got the problem to, okay, what's the equivalent in French, and trying to translate from the English and write it in French, and then it doesn't sound the same, and I'm, unsatisfied. So, yes, one would think that it would be easier, but in fact it's much more difficult because, let's say, the verb system is totally different. In English, you have one verb, but you can be up, in, out, down, over, off. See, you start with this little verb, and it grows, like a tree, a semantic tree, and it's incredible to see that, tweaking just little things can totally change the meaning of. And it's not how it is in French. You've got one verb, one meaning, and it's, so it's a different way of thinking, and I've not been used to that. I don't think I ever considered, seriously to be published in France, because the fact is that whenever you want to be distributed, your book to be distributed in France, you've got to find an editor there. They won't distribute a book from a Quebec editor. Well, they will do it on a very, very small scale. So if you really want to reach the readers in France, you've got to go through again, the whole process of submitting the book or the manuscript and getting edited with a French publisher, which is a pain in the neck, of course. Not to mention the fact that, it's very difficult. It's a very competitive market, and it's very difficult to get attention on your books in France. So from the very early in my career, I realized that it was much more interesting to get translated in English. For a long time, I've been looking at the German market, and it's been a tough game to get the book on the German market, but we did it, and that was amazing. We sold well, and that's a great readership. So for a long time, I realized that France was not an option. Well, it is an option, but it's more like prestigious than really something that leads you somewhere. Okay. Well, every translation is a different, experience. the English translation is done by my translations are done by Laser Letterhandler, who's a translator from Montreal. I know him. I've met him several times. We're good friends, and I am involved at almost every level of the translation by my editor in Toronto. So I'm feeling very close to the result, and there's lots of fact checkings that and details. So that really is a new edition. That's more than a translation. That's an up-to-date edition, and I really feel close to that. But it's not the case with most translation. Usually you don't hear about it, and then poof, the books just appear in your mailbox, and it's been translated. It has been the case for Dutch, Italian, German. Though I've been discussing for the second book, I had discussions, a few questions and answers with my German and Dutch translators. I think that after a couple of books, they realize it's going to be serious, and they kind of think about involving you in the process. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, it gets done, it gets published, and you don't even know it. Lately we just discovered that the Russian translation has been done and published, and we found it on the internet, which was very awkward because in Cyrillic I can't even recognize my name, so that was funny. So on an international level, unless you're J.K. Rowling, things tend to go very slowly. For instance, we are supposed to have the Hebrew translation done by January and published by early spring. But we signed for a Hebrew translation 5 years ago. Well, this is an extreme example, but it's not going fast. So sometimes, in the case of the Russian translation, we signed it, they paid for it, and then, it kind of disappears because you got the check, so you forget about it and you wait for it, and then one morning there's the agent that that says, oh, by the way, it has been done. But there's so many months that have passed by to just almost forget about it. My first advice is never tell a translator something can't be translated. They won't agree. Because I've been, going this residency with the translator, with translators a few years ago, and I realized that is really something you can't talk about. Every text can be translated. That's their motto. But as it happened, my text has been very well translated. In English. I couldn't say for the other languages. But in English, I know Laser isn't only a very clever translator and very competent and efficient translator. He very early in the process understood what the book was about. He understood what were the sub-layers of meaning, and that this chapter wasn't really about what it was, that there was more to the chapter than met the eyes. And so I wasn't, very confident very early that he grasped the book, and he did, a very good job on both of my novels, actually. Well, it feels like a village, but of course 6 million people is still a fairly big population. Montreal is a 3 million inhabitant city, and so, but it's small in the sense that it's a small territory. Going from Montreal to the eastward, the eastern part of the province is a 10 hours drive. And I don't know. I think that it still is a family-based society. We used to have those huge family. And my mother had 13 brothers and sisters, and on my father's side they were 16. And for a long time, around before the war, and they used to have those huge family. And I think that the family remains the basic unit of a society in Quebec. I have this little game whenever I arrive in a new town or I go to a festival or something, and I'm being shuttled by someone, and I ask him, what's your family name? Oh, yes. So you visited this place, and then I ask a few questions, and 9 times, almost always succeed in finding, that he knows this cousin of mine, or he knows this friend of mine. It's very easy to find those links between people. That's why I said it looks like a village. But of course, that's 6 million people, so that's enough to, well, make a living as a writer if you sell enough books. Well, the relationships between the French and English part of Canada, I think they have evolved in the last decades, and we understand each other a bit better. But I think that it still remains what we used to call the two solitudes. We don't know very much about what happens on their side. Neither do they, know a lot about what happens on our side. And they've got. That was funny. I just happened to stumble on YouTube on a television series that was a smashing success in Canada. It was all over the place and never heard about it before. So that's funny to see how there aren't that many bridges between our two cultures. And it's always, anytime a publisher decides to publish English Canadian literature in Quebec, or vice versa, it's always seen as some kind of a revolution. So it's well, things evolves very slowly. There is several English Canadian authors who are well known in Quebec, but they remain, the happy fews. There's the classic ones like Margaret Atwood, but even a guy like Douglas Coupland, which is absolutely, well known, and everyone reads him in Canada. In Quebec, we know him, but he remains a bit, he's not that well known, and maybe it has to see with the fact that they all get translated in French. There was this book last 3 years ago, Lullabies for a Little Criminal by Heather O'Neill. She was a young writer from Montreal who wrote that book that was set in Montreal in English, and then she got this big deal, and it got very, very popular in English Canada. It was everywhere, in the airports. It was literally everywhere. And then, of course, they signed the French rights with an editor a publisher in France, and they made a translation, but a Paris translation. So when I finally saw the book in French in a bookstore in Montreal, I said, "Oh yeah, nice." I was expecting, I was waiting for this to be translated, and I took it and opened it, and on the first page, you've got this taxi driver from Montreal who speaks like he's a Titi from Paris, and I just read like 5 lines, and I almost, threw the book through the bookstore, and it. Exactly the same with Douglas Coupland. It was the same with Mordecai Richler, a very famous English writer from Montreal who got translated in Paris. It comes back in Quebec. We don't recognize it, though it's typical Montreal culture. So maybe part of this solitude, those two solitudes, comes from the fact that they get translated abroad. I think people have very, very polarized idea on this. Some people think that we should write only about Quebec, about Montreal, even using the slang and everything that makes Quebecois French typical. While some other people think that it's time to open to the world and think in a more globalized way. So I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what people's opinion are on this, because I think everyone is a bit confused about it. But it is a question of the utmost importance at the moment in Quebec. It has been for a long time, and since the 60s and the 50s, it's been very important, and it's evolving. It keeps on evolving and changing as we see the culture from abroad coming in Quebec. But I don't think that people have found their answers to this.